Now, anybody who has watched my content knows I cover a lot of cases that involve murders that have happened in the Portland area, murders of all kinds. And even in the most bewildering, inexplicable, unsolved murder cases I've covered, you still almost always have certain details on the matter, certain details that even if they don't solve it, you can at least determine for certain that there was a murder in this scenario. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called an unsolved murder. Even with minimal details, you can almost always tell in a shooting situation. Was it a murder? Was it an accident? Was it something else? But every so often, there comes a case where even with lots of information, you just can't say for certain whether a shooting incident was an accident or if it was a murder. The 1928 death of a woman named Marjorie Stoy is just one such instance of that. So this here behemoth of a structure is the Heathman Hotel, and today's video is about something that happened at the Heathman Hotel. However, it gets a little confusing because in the late 1920s, there were actually two Heathman hotels that were built. The first one that was built, generally referred to as the Old Heathman, and then there was the New Heathman. Well, my story had only said it took place in the Heathman. So which one was it? So I got kind of stressed because I thought, well, it had to happen here because the other Heathman Hotel, the original, it's got to be long gone by now. Then, through a very minimal amount of research, I discovered that this is the Old Heathman Hotel. And it's still here. Fortunately, I found out that it was in the Old Heathman Hotel where this story takes place. So let's keep it simple and start at the beginning. Marjorie Stoy was a 32-year-old woman in 1928. She was from Aberdeen, Washington, where she had lived with her husband, who by this point she had been estranged from. And when they separated, she moved to Portland, where she was staying with a woman named Dorothy Lane at her home, which would have been located at the northwest corner of what is today 19th and Burnside, West 19th and Burnside. I believe there's just like a driveway there today. And on the evening of May 28th, 1928, there was a liquor party that was held at the Lane residence. Now, mind you, this being 1928, this was still the heat of Prohibition, which would actually play a small part in this case later on. The party began early in the evening, and as so often happens, it began to die down a little bit before the end of the day, sometime probably around 11 to 11:30 p.m. And as the party died down, one of the participants there, a 40-year-old man named George Masterson, suggested anybody who wanted to keep the party going could accompany him into downtown, where he had been staying at the Heathman Hotel for a couple of months, because, like Marjorie Stoy, he had also recently become estranged from his wife, with whom he had a couple of children with, and they lived up on Montgomery Street on the edge of the Goose Hollow neighborhood. So a few individuals, we don't know how many, accompanied Masterson to the Heathman. Now, there is a lot of confusion that is possible here. This is 1928, and in the 2 years before then, a Heathman Hotel had been built in Portland, and the next year, another Heathman Hotel was built, known as the New Heathman. The New Heathman is the one that today is regarded as the Heathman Hotel. So it took me a while to even find out which one of these hotels Masterson was staying at, where his party took place. And the old and the new Heathman hotels are diagonal from each other. And after some digging, I found that Masterson was in fact staying at the older Heathman Hotel. So we're at Southwest Salmon and Park, and the old Heathman is located on the northeast corner of that intersection. And this is where Masterson's hotel room was. Now, they say he was in a room that started with, it was in the 300s, which leads me to believe it was on the third floor where his room was located. So it would have been, it was the first floor, second floor. The first floor where you're actually having brick up here would be the floor. I don't know, which room it would have been. Just logistically, that's the floor it would have been on. And this is where everybody relocated to after that first party. Let's keep the party going, and they move to a second location. And this is where ultimately, in the end, it ended up just being Marjorie Stoy and Mr. Masterson up in that room. And they had a complaint come down, claims that they were being too loud. Other guests in the hotel were complaining about that. And they'd been drinking. Plenty of empty alcohol containers were found in the room later on. So, they were drinking, getting loud, and having a good time upstairs. And someone came around midnight who worked here to tell them to keep it down. They said that Masterson opened the door, seemed cool and collected, said, "Oh yeah, sorry, we'll keep it down." And the employee that went up to the room said that they heard a woman's voice inside, the presumption being that that was Marjorie Stoy's voice that they heard. So while we don't know exactly how many people went back to Masterson's room with him, we do know, or can at least stipulate, that ultimately, a little after midnight, it was just him and Marjorie Stoy at the room. One might suggest they hit it off with each other. It didn't seem before this time that their correlation with each other stood out to anybody, that she was of any more interest to him than anybody else who had accompanied him back to his room. But whatever the case, it was just the two of them alone after midnight. Come the following morning, it's now May 29th, 1928. A chambermaid goes up to do the usual rounds, checking on the room. She goes up to Masterson's room He's no longer there, but the chambermaid discovers the body of Marjorie Stoy in his room, laying out on the bed. She has a bullet wound through the lower abdomen that went through her heart, and she was dead. She was also found nude. Her blood-spattered clothes had been found in the bathroom of the room, showing that her killer had removed her clothes after death and then still left them in the room for whatever reason. There were ginger ale and whiskey bottles found in the room, clear signs of the party that had continued into the early morning hours of the 29th. And one bullet and one shell casing from a .32 caliber pistol were also found in the room. So these were clear signs, especially the fact that Marjorie Stoy had been shot straight through the chest, right through the heart, probably died within minutes at the most. It seemed pretty clear that a murder had taken place here. So it was a very, very strange scene. And to make it even more confusing was the fact that the bedding from the bed in the room had also been removed and obviously had blood on it from the simple fact that Marjorie Stoy had been on the bed. That had also been removed, which begs the question of where she actually landed when she was shot. I never found any explanation as to whether there was blood that seeped through onto the bedding, and even if there had, how do we know that that didn't come from if she had been placed on the bed? Meaning, if the bedding had been removed and she had been on the bed when she died, she would have had to have been removed from the bed so the bedding could be taken off and then placed back on it. So we can't say for absolute certain exactly where she was in the room when she was shot, and there was a lot of blood splatter on the floor as well as the walls to help confuse matters. And what was also of interest, and this was the first sign that a situation like this that was immediately considered a murder, after a little more examination, authorities began to question that notion, primarily because the wound that Marjorie Stoy had sustained had entered in her abdomen near her stomach and had a sharp upward trajectory to go up into her heart. It seemed a little difficult for that to have happened if she was lying in bed and Masterson was standing over her, although that would have been a perfect trajectory if he was pointing the gun down. He shoots her, it goes through the stomach and ultimately reaches the heart further down. But authorities felt that she was likely standing up when she died. One newspaper said that they felt she was standing near a dresser that was next to the bed when she was shot. So are we to believe that Masterson was sitting on the floor and accidentally shot her? The complications of not knowing exactly where Marjorie Stoy was when she was shot, that alone was destined to make this case confusing and to make it difficult for them to slam the books on it as a murder case. And obviously, by the time all of this was discovered, George Masterson was long gone. He had fled the scene, which in and of itself is enough to make one look guilty. And authorities were pretty quick, and this was fairly common back then, to suggest the possibility that he had committed suicide. This was bolstered, however, when authorities discovered some of his personal belongings floating in the Willamette River, led people to believe that he may have just dove into the river and just let himself drown. But it was very confusing because it did not seem, again, at the time, like Masterson and Stoy knew one another. It was presumed that they had met that night for the first time at this initial party at the Lane house. And it seemed very strange that they would get along so well, continue partying in his hotel room, and after such a brief time of being together wherein nobody saw any animosity or hostilities expressed by either party, why Masterson would suddenly just pull his gun out and kill her. However, there are some interesting little tidbits of information about Stoy and Masterson long before this particular event happened that might make one reconsider, without knowing for certain, whether or not they had met for the first time that night. Namely, Stoy had lived with her husband Archie in Marshfield, Oregon, which is along the Oregon coast. And Masterson had been known to do business there for many, many years. In fact, just about 10 days before this shooting happened, he'd been down in Marshfield on business. So he was known to be there frequently, where the Stoys lived. The Stoys relocated to Aberdeen, Washington, while Archie, as it was reported, pursued a career as a boxer. Interestingly enough, George Masterson was also known to frequently do business in Aberdeen, Washington, and it was found that he'd made many calls to that city, some of which were business calls, but some of which weren't. Interestingly enough, when Archie Stoy was spoken to after this shooting, he expressed the belief that his estranged wife and Masterson had actually met and cultivated at least a cordial friendship of some kind while they were still together in Aberdeen, long before she left. I don't know exactly where he got that inference, but that was her husband's assertion, was that they likely knew each other at that time. And with it being so strange that conveniently Masterson would frequently be in the same towns that Marjorie Stoy had lived in this time previous to her arrival in Portland, it's possible that they could have met one another by chance. It's possible they could have cultivated an affair together, which might have led Archie to think that they knew each other beforehand. He might have even thought Masterson had something to do with why his wife left him. Granted, that's a fairly common tactic among men when their wives or girlfriends leave them. It's a presumption that they're just leaving them for another man. But stories such as this suddenly opened up the door to the possibility that these two had a much longer standing relationship with one another, one that may have been an affair from their respective spouses, and having a more lengthy period of time together like that, where there's a lot of engagement going on that it goes unseen by the public, who knows what their relationship may have actually been like. Maybe there were rocky moments. Maybe there were instances that could have led George Masterson to a point of rage that may have in part been fused by the alcohol. Maybe there was some reason why he killed Marjorie Stoy that was directly connected to their prior experience with each other. That was suddenly a question to consider now, among many others. But despite the fact that some of his belongings were found in the river, and authorities did think it was fairly likely that he had taken his own life rather than be apprehended and face the repercussions for his actions, authorities still had to keep pursuing him without assumption. If this guy was still on the run and this was just a misdirection on his part to make people think he killed himself, then he's still out there evading justice. So the police had to keep working. And it wouldn't take too long before authorities did, in fact, discover that George Masterson was still alive. And the primary reason they were able to establish that was based on two witnesses, a cab driver and a hotel clerk. This allowed the police to trace Masterson's actions, presumably right after the shooting of Marjorie Stoy. He had hailed a cab to the front of the Heathman Hotel, and he took that cab across the river where he was dropped off at the New Sergeant Hotel, which would have been located on the corner of Hawthorne and Grand Avenue. The taxi driver noticed specifically that when Masterson got into his vehicle that his left hand was bloody, like he'd injured it in some way. That would become of significance later on. He then registered at the New Sergeant Hotel. The desk clerk who saw him said when he walked in, he looked completely disheveled. There was blood all over his suit. Why the clerk didn't call the police immediately upon seeing this is anybody's guess. But Masterson was, in his condition, allowed to register for a room, which he used only briefly. He used it long enough to change out of his bloody suit, which he left there in his hotel room to be found later. And then he abruptly departed in new, clean clothes that didn't look suspicious, and he left the hotel to essentially go on the run. And there was a definite reason to believe that Masterson was going to flee the city completely, either north or south. And that was just in the fact that when he was picked up by this taxi driver, before going to the New Sergeant Hotel, he actually had the driver take him in the direction of Union Station. But before he got there, he, interestingly enough, asked the taxi driver to turn and take him back to the Heathman, even though there's a dead body sitting in there waiting to be discovered by someone. Granted, it's the middle of the night. That would have been unlikely, but it was still risky for him to go back. And apparently he said he needed to go back because he left his money in the room. Maybe that's the real reason. Maybe there was something else to it. But he did return to his hotel room briefly before returning to the cab. And instead of going back towards Union Station where he said he wanted to be taken, which makes sense, you hop a train and split town, he has a taxi driver take him to the New Sergeant. It's possible that in his condition, blood all over him, that he felt he would have gotten attention from individuals at Union Station, which is always full of people, and that's a lot of possible witnesses. So he may have reconsidered and thought, okay, well, I can't stay at the Heathman. That's too risky. So how about I just get another hotel room real quickly away from the scene across the river, just so I can at least change my clothes, clean myself up, and then run away without having a guilty look about me. I'm just another guy on the street at that point. And by May 31st, Masterson was, in effect, up in Washington, in the vicinity of Seattle, but authorities didn't notice this. And as much as they were convinced that Masterson split town because that was the logical thing to do, and seemed to be what he did based on the circumstances that they had to go with, the police found themselves misdirected again. On May 31st, the key to Masterson's room was discovered by a man named Arnendo Zancoli. And he found the key at Broadway and Burnside, several blocks north of the Heathman. So it appears that Masterson was in that area and dropped the key, either intentionally or accidentally. But the fact that the key was found led police to think that Masterson was still in the city. And the reasoning for this was Zancoli found the key, and without telling anybody, brought it back to the hotel and just slipped it into their mailbox. So the key was initially found in the mailbox, but nobody knew who put it there. And the thought was Masterson must have done that. So if Masterson, on May 31st, a couple days after the murder, put that key in the mailbox of the hotel, that means he was right outside the Heathman on that day. So for about a day, authorities were centering their search more around Portland again. And then Zancoli heard that this was happening and realized he had to come forward and explain why the key was found where it was, and that no, it was not evidence that Masterson was still in the city. It was just that it had been found in the city by somebody else. So despite that misdirection, it took a day away from the search for Masterson. And actually, when all is said and done, Masterson ended up giving himself up. It's June 2nd, 1928. Masterson finally gives himself up to police in Seattle. He has been on the run for several days, and he's noticed to have a wound in his left hand that he said he'd been treating with iodine to keep it from getting infected. And it was felt that that must have been caused by the same bullet that hit Marjorie Stoy, but that was based only on the fact that one bullet was found in the room. So the presumption was that only one shot had been fired. So if a bullet caused that wound, it must have been the same one that caused the damage sustained by Marjorie Stoy. And he was even quoted as saying, because Masterson's attitude was that he went into a full-out panic and fled the scene and had spent several days just feeling miserable about the whole situation and feeling guilty that this accident had happened, because of course that's exactly what he said it was. And he was quoted to say, "It wasn't my hand that bothered me, it was my mind." So he immediately went to the police and said, yes, this happened, yes, I ran away, and yes, it was an accident. And again, they'd been drinking, and any one of us that's been drunk before knows lots of things can accidentally happen when you're drunk. And he had actually ditched the murder weapon in Vancouver, Washington, right across the border while he was fleeing to Seattle. So the gun in the case was recovered. Not that it meant so much, because again, Masterson was admitting to the shooting. And once in custody, he was able to give his side of the story. And what's interesting about authorities saying that they felt there was only one bullet involved was the fact that actually the gun that Masterson had used held 7 rounds in its chamber and was found to have 5 in there. So it's possible that 2 shots had been fired in that room. So for whatever reason, one bullet was left in there and the other was presumably taken by Masterson, which makes things a little bit interesting when, now that he's in custody, authorities are allowed to hear his side of the story. And of course, as one would expect, he claimed the whole thing was an accident. And it's kind of a strange story, but it could have happened. And this is that ultimately everyone goes back to Masterson's hotel room. One by one they leave, and it's finally just him and Marjorie. They're drinking, having a good time, and Marjorie notices that Masterson has a gun in this bag that he carries with him. And she expressed interest in it. She wanted to see it. So Masterson thought, why not? He removed the gun from the bag and was in the process of trying to remove the rounds from the gun so that he could safely hand it to her when the gun accidentally went off, shooting him through the left hand and hitting her. So that correlated with the story that police had already been reporting, that they felt there was only one shot involved. So he would have known that information. And the reason I bring that up is the fact that since 2 rounds were found to have been fired from that gun, it's possible 2 shots may have been fired in that room. Now, obviously, maybe one of the rounds had been fired at a different time, but it leaves open the potential that one round shot Marjorie Stoy and another round fired may have been Masterson shooting himself in his own hand to make it look like an accident. And what further makes me a little bit suspicious of the timing of Masterson giving himself up to police, which was June 2nd, was this coincided perfectly with a grand jury that had convened in the city of Portland. Even though Masterson was missing, the police were moving forward on indicting him on a murder charge. Once they found him, he would face that. And right when he was indicted on that murder charge is when he turned himself into authorities. Beforehand, he was just a man on the run. not necessarily knowing exactly all that was going on back in town in relation to the shooting of Marjorie Stoy or how fervently the police were pursuing him. But by this point, he knew that he was indicted on first-degree murder. So now, once he's apprehended, he's going to face the potential of an execution if he's convicted. So what does he do? Does he keep running and most likely inevitably get caught? Or does he do the right thing, so to speak, and turn himself in with this great explanation as to why Marjorie Stoy turned up dead in his room? And what's most interesting is now that Masterson is back in Portland and he's actually going to go on trial for this shooting, we're dealing with a possible murder case here. The locals appear to be focused on every aspect of the situation other than the simple fact that this might have been a murder case. Many people looked on both Masterson and Stoy with negativity because it was presumed that they had been engaging in an affair with each other, and they were both married. They were both engaging in adultery. So there was a lot of criticism for that. And beyond that, there was a lot of focus put on the fact that they'd been partying together. And there was this attitude that, this is an example of what happens when you engage in these parties, which meant getting together and drinking. This is still the height of Prohibition, and while there's a lot of people that think Prohibition is stupid, there's a lot of people that fall in line with whatever the law says. And so there was a big hullabaloo about the partying alcohol aspect of this. But it didn't seem like a lot of people really wanted to talk about murder, even while Masterson was putting in a plea of not guilty when he was arraigned, setting up for a trial that was guaranteed to intrigue, but also likely to lead to an acquittal, because there was so much back and forth, the possibilities of what happened. And in all fairness, especially with his wounded hand, there was potential validity to the story that Masterson had told explaining how the shooting had took place. So it was going to be very difficult for a trial jury to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And in the end, a trial never even happened, because with the complications that came with this case, with the trial rapidly approaching, even after Masterson had already put through a plea of not guilty and the next step was being prepped, ultimately the district attorney came forward and asked to have the charges dismissed. They literally knew if they took this guy to trial, even with all the negative backlash from people around town. Some people thought he was a murderer. Some people thought he was an adulterer. Some people thought he was a drunk. And still, with all that negativity against Masterson, the district attorney knew that this was a case they probably weren't going to win. So why waste the time doing it? Why waste the taxpayers' money on a case that clearly we don't really know fully what happened? So it's really interesting because in the end, Masterson, who's the focus of the story and shoots a woman, accidental or not, ends up doing no time for the events that transpired in this case. He's released, not even put on trial. But a woman named Stella Pettifer actually ends up doing time in this case. Now, who is Stella Pettifer? Well, as far as law enforcement could tell, she was somebody that was supplying people with alcohol in the neighborhood. And the whole reason that she came under the local police's radar is due to a note that they'd found in Dorothy Lane's place because they knew she'd been having a party there with alcohol, and the police actually raided her home, thinking there was going to be this massive stock of booze all over her house, which they never did find. But they did find a note in relation to Stella, which discussed, like, hey, if you need any more booze, just let me know, showing that Stella Pettifer was the likely individual that had supplied the alcohol that was drank at Dorothy Lane's place before, again, the party moved on to George Masterson's hotel room. So, in this case, the only person who really actually did any time was this random individual who actually had nothing to do with the shooting event itself. So when all was said and done, George Masterson was allowed to go and never indicted on any murder charges. It just could not be determined beyond a reasonable doubt that this was not even an intentional murder, but even really a case of manslaughter. So, I don't know if I've ever covered a case that ended like that, where the man who did the shooting was allowed to go free, so you can argue it wasn't a murder case, but again, it was only determined to be that because there just wasn't enough to prove that the shooting was intentional. And there's so much to this case that makes that even more complex, because there's so many little things that you can use to argue guilt in Masterson's case, or that the shooting was accidental. And what was very frustrating on the matter was that despite all the questions in this case, and this was done even before Masterson had actually been, taken to a grand jury, and then they decide what goes on with him, the coroner decided not to do an inquiry on the matter, which, regardless of what was reported in local newspapers, leaves a lot of questions about the state of Marjorie Stoy's body and where exactly the entry point of the bullet was, where it exited, what part of the heart it hit. But she was turned over to her husband and buried shortly after, and that was laid to rest. So that alone left a lot of unanswered questions in terms of what exactly happened in that room. And again, as I discussed earlier, we don't even know exactly where Marjorie Stoy was in the room, what her position was. Was she standing up? Was she laying on the bed? Those questions could not be fully answered because it was abundantly clear that even had she been on the bed, she had been taken off the bed. So how could we prove that she had been there before the bedding had been taken off? And again, what do we make of the fact that one bullet was found in Masterson's hotel room, but there were 2 missing rounds in his gun? Does that suggest, again, another round possibly fired? And what would the circumstances of that been, and why was that bullet not found in the hotel room? Why would that have been removed? Did Masterson take it to make it appear as though only one bullet had been fired, and therefore the bullet that went through his hand must have also been the one that hit Marjorie Stoy? Ergo, this whole event was an accident? I still find Masterson's explanation of how the gun even ended up in his hand in the first place a little bit convoluted. It absolutely could have happened, but I find it a bit strange that they're just sitting there, they're unwinding, they've been together for hours, and Marjorie Stoy just kind of looks over and sees a gun, and it's just like, oh, let's pull out your gun and look at it. I know they're drunk, but that doesn't suddenly mean that in the middle of this potentially romantic rendezvous that one is going to suddenly become interested in the firearm that the other one has. This was 1920s Portland. Every man had a gun. It wasn't exactly a unique thing to find a gun in a man's possessions. And he just kind of pulls it out because he wants to show it to her, and he accidentally ends up firing it while he's trying to remove the rounds from it. He was trying to remove those so that if he handed it to her or whatever, that it wouldn't accidentally go off. And he knew that they were drinking, and that an accident like that could happen. And you wouldn't want that to happen with real bullets in the gun. So he was a smart enough gun owner to know that, and yet somehow, while he's trying to be safe, and while he's doing this whole other event, he ends up pulling the trigger. Now, could that have just been the result of the booze? Maybe. That's one of the most frustrating things about this case, is there's some things that you don't really know what they mean or how to explain them, but there was alcohol involved. So, again, it could go either way. One of the strongest elements of the situation that made authorities think that this might have been an accident, again, was the angle of the wound. It was a very sharp, angled up wound that it seemed logical based on Masterson's story. If Marjorie Stoy is standing up and he's sitting down and he has the gun at a low angle and is possibly pointed up, a gunshot like that makes sense, whereas it doesn't in a lot of other circumstances. However, if Marjorie Stoy is laying flat on the bed and he is standing above her and shoots at her, a bullet angled down could go in through the stomach and through to the heart like that. So, could he have shot her while she was in a vulnerable position and thus done it intentionally? That's another question on the matter. And obviously another element of significance that I think, even more so than the angle of the shooting, really put considerable doubt in everyone's mind, which was the fact that Masterson had a wounded hand that corroborated his account, so to speak. It certainly made it logic. Well, you know, he shot through the hand. How was that accidental? So he accidentally shoots himself through the hand, and the bullet ends up going into Marjorie Stoy. But how do we know for absolute certain that he didn't do that afterwards? The idea could have come to him, hey, I can make this look like an accident. And what better way to prove it was an accident than to say it happened this way and then wound myself the same way? Now, he would have had to have done this immediately after the murder, because when he left the hotel and got in with the cab driver said he had a wounded hand. Now, it did not say to what extent it had been injured, just that there was blood on his hand. So it gave the appearance that he had been injured there in some way. So that's something you have to question. Would he have thought to do something like that quickly in those immediate moments after? Or did he really accidentally shoot himself through the hand and kill her and fled the place in fear? The fact that he fled the scene is another element. That, what does that mean? Did he panic? You know, he just shot somebody. If he did it accidentally, did he just panic and run away? Did he panic and flee because he knew no one would believe this was an accident? Or did he flee the scene simply because he had just committed a murder and knew he had to get away? And possibly most critical is, what would Masterson's motive have been? And that gets potentially at the question, again, of how long did he and Marjorie Stoy know each other? Were they new acquaintances, or had they actually known each other for a while, as Marjorie's husband at least thought was the case? If they were new acquaintances, it seems a little far-fetched that they would just meet, seem to get along, and then a couple hours later he's suddenly murdering her. But if they had a previous experience before, for example, a torrid love affair, which can create all kinds of complications and frustrations and arguments, and could something like that have happened? An argument ensued. The booze fueled it, and George Masterson got angry and shot her. I have covered this numerous times in numerous cases from this particular period of time of the earlier part of the 20th century, these cases of men engaged in affairs, torrid relationships, and even sometimes just pursuing women that didn't really want them the same way that they wanted them. And these men oftentimes solved their anger or frustration with a bullet. Could it have been they possibly had an ongoing affair that Marjorie Stoy was finally getting tired of? Maybe she wanted to go another way. Maybe she met another man and was thinking about cultivating something with him. If Masterson suddenly becomes a scorned lover, and again, fueled by the alcohol, would that have been enough for him to kill Marjorie Stoy? And of course, who would know about this except him and Marjorie? So if she's dead, he doesn't even have to explain that away. He can just come back to town and just say, hey, we were partying, we were having fun, and then this horrible, tragic accident happened. And he can maintain till the end that they barely knew each other, that he had no motivation for killing this random stranger who we only met through a party, and he walks away. So those are just, a list of some of the things that, in one way, you can argue that they suggest murder, and on the other hand, they could also argue that this shooting was an accident. And I'm sure there's others that I haven't even considered yet, but that is just the initial list. And I still, if I went with my gut feeling on this, I'd say I'm about 60-40 in favor that this was an accident. Obviously, that's what most people felt back in 1928 when this happened. But despite the fact that I tend to lean towards this just being an unlikely scenario where someone's gun accidentally went off and it just happened to be pointing in the worst possible direction, even though I kind of side with Masterson on his story, if you'd pardon the pun, put a gun to my head, I still can't say I'm a 100% convinced that this wasn't intentional or wasn't the result of something other than an accident, like a moment of rage that may have been fueled by alcohol that George Masterson had come to due to some prior experience with Marjorie Stoy that we just don't know about. I cannot say that I am 100% decided one way or another. And that, more than anything, is what makes this story so intriguing to me.